Hamid had always been the daring one in his group, the one who laughed in the face of old superstitions and dared to go where no one else would. That was why, on this moonless night, he convinced his 3 friends, Samir, Bilal, and Farouk, to drive out with him to the abandoned mosque on the edge of town, a place shrouded in decades of whispered stories and fear. The car's headlights barely lit the narrow dirt road, and the air outside was unnaturally cold, carrying a stillness that pressed down on them as though the night itself was holding its breath. When they finally stopped, the mosque loomed before them like a sleeping giant, its once grand dome cracked and weathered, its minaret leaning slightly as though tired of holding secrets for so long. The entrance was choked with creeping vines, and the wooden door hung crookedly on rusted hinges, swaying faintly even though there was no wind. "Looks worse than I thought," Samir muttered, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the tremor in his voice. Hamid just smirked, grabbed his flashlight, and motioned for the others to follow. As soon as they stepped into the courtyard, the air seemed to change, the night sounds faded, the crickets stopped chirping, and even the trees nearby stood unnaturally still. They could hear the crunch of their own footsteps on the dusty ground, each step sounding too loud, too intrusive, as though the place was rejecting their presence. Inside, the mosque was a shadow of its former self. Dust lay thick over the once beautiful prayer mats, and the walls were cracked and peeling. Bits of Arabic calligraphy still clung stubbornly to the plaster, but some sections had been violently scratched out, leaving deep grooves as if someone, or something, had tried to erase the words by force. A strange smell lingered in the air, faintly metallic, like rust or dried blood. Near the mihrab, Hamid's flashlight landed on a dark, irregular stain on the floor. "Blood," he said with a grin, half joking, though the sound of his voice seemed too loud, bouncing back at them from the walls as if the building itself was listening. Before any of them could reply, a sound broke the silence, a faint whisper, so soft they almost thought they imagined it. It came from the far corner of the mosque, too deliberate to be wind, too human to be anything else. Samir froze, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he asked, but Hamid just tightened his grip on the flashlight and took a step toward the sound. The whisper came again, clearer this time, a single drawn-out word that none of them could quite understand. The air grew heavier, and for the first time that night, even Hamid felt a chill crawl up his spine. Hamid took another cautious step toward the corner, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the darkness like a knife, illuminating swirls of dust hanging heavy in the air. The whisper had gone silent again, but its echoes seemed to linger in the walls, crawling under their skin and making the air feel alive with unseen movement. Samir grabbed Hamid's arm, whispering harshly that they should leave, but Hamid shook him off and crouched near the corner where the sound had come from. There was nothing there, just cracked tiles, a collapsed wooden beam, and a layer of dust so thick it seemed no living thing had touched it for years. But then the whisper came again, directly behind them this time, impossibly close, like someone speaking softly into their ears. All 4 spun around, flashlights darting wildly, but there was no one there, just the empty prayer hall staring back at them with its hollow darkness. Farouk cursed under his breath, his voice cracking, and started backing toward the exit, but Bilal stopped him, pointing to something on the far wall. Under the faded calligraphy, carved deep into the plaster, were fresh markings, lines and scratches that hadn't been there before. They weren't random, they formed strange symbols, unfamiliar and wrong, shapes that made the eyes hurt if they stared too long. "Those weren't there when we walked in," Bilal said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Hamid's throat felt dry, but his curiosity burned hotter than his fear. He reached out and traced one of the symbols with his finger, and the instant he did, the temperature in the mosque dropped sharply, their breath misting in the air as though winter had crept in through unseen cracks. Suddenly, from deep within the mosque, a door slammed shut, a sound so loud it echoed like thunder, making them all flinch. Samir's flashlight flickered then went out completely, plunging them into semi-darkness except for the narrow beam of Hamid's light. Somewhere in the shadows, the whisper returned, but this time it was joined by another, and then another, until dozens of voices seemed to overlap, speaking in a language none of them could understand, chanting in a low, rhythmic tone that made their stomachs twist. The sound seemed to come from the very walls, as if the building itself was alive and speaking to them. Farouk bolted toward the exit, but when he reached the doorway, he froze, letting out a strangled cry. The door they had entered through was now completely shut, though none of them remembered closing it. Hamid ran to it and pulled hard, but it didn't budge. It felt as though something on the other side was holding it shut, something massive and unyielding. Samir began to panic, pounding on the wood and shouting for help even though they were miles from the nearest house. "Stop!" Bilal hissed, pointing toward the mihrab again. A shape had appeared there, tall and thin, almost blending with the shadows, but unmistakably human in form. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle as though it was watching them with an invisible gaze. Hamid raised his flashlight, and for a split second the beam caught its face, or what should have been a face, but there was nothing there, just darkness where its features should be. The figure didn't move, but the whispers grew louder, surrounding them from every direction, making it hard to think. Farouk sank to his knees, muttering prayers under his breath, his voice shaking. Hamid, despite the terror clawing at his insides, stepped forward, determined not to let fear control him. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the mosque, but the figure only tilted its head further, and then, without warning, it vanished, gone as if it had never been there. The chanting stopped abruptly, leaving behind a ringing silence that was somehow worse than the noise. And then, from above them, came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing across the wooden balcony where the muezzin would have once called the adhan. But the balcony had collapsed years ago. There was no way anyone could be up there. Dust rained down from the ceiling with each step, and the sound grew faster, circling them, until it felt like dozens of unseen feet were running above their heads. Bilal screamed and swung his flashlight upward, but there was nothing there, just the rotting beams of the ceiling. Suddenly, Hamid's flashlight flickered violently before going out completely, plunging them into total darkness. The whispers returned, this time right next to their ears, a single word repeated over and over in a tone that was almost mocking. Though none of them recognized the language, the meaning was clear: it wanted them gone. And then, as quickly as it started, everything went silent again. The door creaked open on its own, slowly, invitingly, as if whatever held them inside was now letting them go. None of them moved at first, frozen by the sudden stillness, the open door looking less like an escape and more like a trap. Hamid's heart pounded in his ears, louder than the silence itself, but when Farouk suddenly leapt to his feet and ran toward the exit, the others followed instinctively. The cold night air outside the mosque felt like salvation, until they realized they were not outside at all. Instead of the dirt road and the car waiting for them, they were standing in another hallway, narrow and suffocating, with walls of old stone and faintly glowing Arabic inscriptions that pulsed like veins. This wasn't here before," Samir stammered, spinning around only to see the mosque's prayer hall vanish behind them like a mirage. The hallway stretched impossibly far in both directions, lit only by the sickly glow of the inscriptions, and the air was damp, heavy with the smell of mold and something else, something sweet and rotten. Hamid felt anger rise in him, stronger than fear, and he started walking, determined to find a way out, though every step echoed strangely, as if the floor was hollow beneath them. The others had no choice but to follow. As they moved deeper, the walls seemed to close in, the inscriptions growing brighter until the light was almost blinding. Bilal swore under his breath and shielded his eyes, but when he looked closer, he realized the writing had changed. The words, though still in Arabic script, were no longer prayers but something else entirely, phrases repeated over and over, names scratched violently into the stone, some so deep they looked carved by claws. One name appeared again and again: Hamid. His blood ran cold, his breath catching in his throat. He reached out a trembling hand to touch one of the carvings, but before he could, a low groaning sound rose from beneath their feet, as if something massive had stirred below the floor. The ground vibrated, just enough to make the dust fall from the ceiling in a slow, deliberate shower. Samir grabbed Hamid's arm. "We have to turn back," he said, but when they looked behind them, the hallway was gone, replaced by an unbroken wall of stone. There was no way back. The groaning sound turned into a rhythmic thud, like a heartbeat, pulsing through the floor, walls, and their own chests. The glow from the inscriptions dimmed, plunging them into near darkness, and from somewhere ahead came a sound none of them would ever forget, the slow, wet drag of something being pulled across stone, followed by a deep exhale that smelled of earth and decay. A shadow moved at the far end of the hallway, so tall it nearly touched the ceiling, its form shifting as though it was made of smoke. Bilal's flashlight beam finally caught it for a split second, revealing a glimpse of something inhuman, elongated limbs, a face that seemed to twist and melt like wax, empty eye sockets that still somehow stared straight at them. The creature moved in an unnatural lurching motion, its limbs bending at impossible angles as it began to crawl toward them, its long fingers scraping deep gouges into the stone floor. Farouk screamed and bolted down the hall in the opposite direction, disappearing around a corner that hadn't been there a moment ago. The others had no choice but to follow, their footsteps pounding against the floor as the sound of the creature's scraping grew louder, closer, almost playful. The hallway twisted and turned like a maze, but no matter how far they ran, the air seemed to grow thicker, the walls narrower, until they felt like they were being swallowed whole. They turned another corner and found themselves in a wide underground chamber, the floor covered in cracked tiles arranged in a perfect circle. In the center lay something that froze them all in place, a human skeleton, perfectly preserved, its hands bound together with what looked like rusted iron chains. Around the skeleton were symbols painted in dark, dried blood, forming a circle that glowed faintly as if alive. Hamid stepped closer despite Samir's desperate pleas, his eyes fixed on the skeleton's skull. There, carved deep into the bone, was his own name again, Hamid, followed by a date, tonight's date. Before he could react, the ground beneath the skeleton split open, and a blast of cold air swept through the chamber, carrying with it a chorus of whispers that rose into a deafening wail. The creature from the hallway appeared at the entrance, but now there were more, shapes emerging from the shadows, dozens of them, all tall and faceless, their bodies swaying like they were caught in some unseen prayer. Hamid felt his legs weaken as the circle of blood began to glow brighter, and suddenly the skeleton twitched, its jaw snapping open with a crack. The chains rattled, and the floor beneath them began to crumble, revealing nothing but blackness below. The chamber felt like it was tilting, pulling them toward the pit, and the last thing Hamid heard before the floor gave way was the whisper again, clear and unmistakable this time, speaking in a voice that sounded eerily like his own. "You were always meant to return." The world seemed to dissolve as the floor gave way, and for a moment Hamid felt as though he were falling through empty space, his stomach twisting, his ears filled with the roar of wind and whispers. When he hit the ground, it was not stone but something soft, damp, and disturbingly warm, as though he had landed on flesh. The air was suffocatingly thick and smelled of blood, rot, and incense burned long ago. He scrambled to his feet, coughing, and saw that the others had fallen too, scattered around him, groaning and disoriented. Above them, the chamber they had just left was gone, as if it had never existed, just a ceiling of pulsing darkness overhead. The ground around them was alive, or at least it seemed to be, shifting slightly under their weight, and as Hamid's eyes adjusted, he realized with a shock that they were standing in what looked like an enormous underground prayer hall. But the architecture was wrong, too narrow, too organic, the walls appearing to breathe with every passing second. Along these walls were hundreds of shadowy figures, all kneeling in rows like worshippers, their heads bowed, their bodies swaying rhythmically. They were not human. Their limbs were too long, their spines twisted at unnatural angles, and their faces, if they had faces, were nothing but black voids where eyes and mouths should be. They moved in perfect unison, murmuring in that same low chant they had heard before, a sound that made Hamid's stomach turn and his mind feel as though it were being pulled apart. Samir grabbed Hamid's shoulder, his nails digging into his skin. "We have to get out of here," he hissed, his voice breaking. But there was no clear exit, only a single archway at the far end of the hall, glowing faintly with a red light. As if sensing their thoughts, the chanting suddenly stopped, and the entire hall fell into a silence so absolute that it felt like being submerged underwater. Then, slowly, one of the figures at the front of the rows rose to its feet and turned toward them. Its body was impossibly tall, its head brushing the ceiling, and as it stepped closer, the others followed, one by one, until the hall was filled with the sound of countless feet scraping against the floor. The leader figure extended a hand, long, bony fingers ending in claw-like tips, and pointed at Hamid. A deep, resonant voice filled the space, not from its mouth but from everywhere at once, vibrating in their skulls. The one who broke the seal has returned. Hamid's knees nearly buckled. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, though his voice sounded small and useless in the vast, living chamber. The figure tilted its head, and in that instant, the walls around them changed. The breathing walls seemed to melt away, revealing visions, flashes of the mosque as it once was, filled with worshippers, light streaming through its windows. But then came fire, screams, blood pooling on the floor. Hamid saw men dragging someone into the mihrab, chaining him to the ground, and reciting prayers over his writhing body as though sealing something inside him. The vision shifted again, and Hamid saw the man's face clearly. It was his own. Or rather, someone who looked exactly like him, his eyes wide with rage and terror as the chains were tightened. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. This wasn't just an abandoned mosque. This was a prison. And whatever had been chained here had been waiting for centuries. The leader's voice spoke again, softer now, almost mournful. "The blood remembers. The debt must be repaid." Before Hamid could move, the ground beneath him split open in a jagged line, revealing a pit of swirling darkness, and from it rose a shape far larger than any of the figures around them. It was a mass of shadow and bone, dozens of faces twisting and screaming within its form, as if hundreds of souls were trapped inside it. A hand the size of a man's torso reached up and wrapped around Hamid's legs, pulling him toward the pit. Samir and Bilal tried to grab him, screaming his name, but the ground around them turned slick, making it impossible to hold on. Farouk had already collapsed to his knees, sobbing and muttering prayers, his mind seemingly shattered. The leader figure stepped closer until it towered over Hamid and whispered one final word in that same voice that filled every corner of the hall. "Complete!" The pit flared with crimson light, and Hamid was yanked into it, his screams swallowed by the darkness. The last thing he saw before he was completely consumed was the leader's hollow face bending close, as if to watch his final moments. Then there was nothing, just silence, just void. The silence after Hamid's disappearance was unbearable, so thick it pressed against the eardrums like deep water. Samir and Bilal stood frozen, staring at the pit where their friend had just been swallowed, unable to process what had happened. Farouk was rocking back and forth on his knees, whispering feverishly, his hands clutching at his hair as though trying to rip the memory from his mind. The leader figure remained standing, unmoving, its empty face directed at the remaining three as if weighing them, deciding whether to spare them or claim them too. Then, without warning, the pit snapped shut with a sickening sound, leaving behind nothing but solid ground, as though it had never been there. The red glow faded, plunging the chamber into darkness once again. One by one, the kneeling figures around them began to lower themselves back to the ground, resuming their strange, eternal prayer as if nothing had happened. The leader turned its head toward the archway at the far end of the hall, and without speaking, the door creaked open, revealing a passage bathed in pale moonlight. Samir didn't wait for an invitation. He grabbed Bilal's arm, yanked him toward the opening, and shouted at Farouk to follow. The three of them stumbled through the passage, running until their lungs burned, until the chanting was nothing but a faint echo behind them. When they finally emerged, they found themselves standing outside the mosque again, the night air cool and crisp as though nothing had happened at all. Their car was still parked where they had left it, the keys still in the ignition, as if the last hours had been a dream. None of them spoke as they got in and drove away, each lost in their own thoughts, their faces pale and haunted. Samir gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, glancing constantly at the rearview mirror, as if expecting something to follow them. Farouk remained silent the entire drive, staring blankly out the window, tears streaking down his face. By the time they reached the edge of town, dawn was beginning to break, painting the horizon in soft pinks and golds. For a brief moment, it almost felt like they had escaped, like they could put the nightmare behind them. But then Bilal let out a strangled gasp, pointing at the rear window. Samir glanced back and nearly swerved the car off the road. There, standing in the distance just beyond the fading silhouette of the mosque, was Hamid.